Good evening, everybody. My name is Quentin Innes. Welcome to RAUSI. This presentation today is with Lieutenant Colonel David Redman. We're lucky enough to have him to come and present to us. Colonel Redman is the former head of Emergency Measures Alberta. Before that, he served 27 years in the Canadian Army. He did 3 tours of Germany, the Middle East, and Balkans. He served with the Governor General for a year post-retirement, and then with Emergency Measures for 5 years. Subsequent to that, he was a consultant, both in Canada and the States, and he is now successfully fully retired and is a full-time grandfather. Welcome to RAUSI, David, and I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. David has about a 20-minute presentation. Following that, we'll take questions from the audience. Please, you have 2 options. You can put your questions in the chat, or you can use the functionality on Zoom to raise a hand, and that'll put you to the top left corner of the screen, and we can start tracking you from there. Just a couple of ground rules here. This is Chatham House rules, so yes, it's being recorded. Yes, it'll be distributed, but David has a privileged platform, and he will answer your questions as fully and completely as he can. Please keep the discussion respectful. If somebody is stepping out of line, frankly, I'm just going to cut them off. So without further ado, I'll now turn that over to David. Sir?
Thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. Folks, tonight I'd like to talk from the highest level and then focus down. And we're going to talk ultimately about the Canadian Armed Forces, where they're at. And I was always taught as an Army officer, you never just present a problem, you must come with a viable solution. And so at the end of the presentation, I'll be going through a possible way for rebuilding the Canadian Armed Forces. But I want to start sort of with a vision level and start talking at the view of Canada. I'm going to talk about the national interests of our country. Then I'm going to talk about national security, one of the national interests of our country, and then drill down to the Canadian Armed Forces and then sum it up. I know many of you who are on the call tonight remember 1967, the centenary of our country, and understand the way as a teenager, I was a teenager in 1967, the country felt about who we were and what we were. We had an extremely proud history, and we were a strong, unified country. The world watched us, and we were internationally respected with a very strong economy and a vibrant democracy. And many people were saying around the world that the next century belongs to Canada. Unfortunately, now in 2025, the world doesn't look at us the same. We're ashamed of our history. Our allies see us as a burden rather than as a reliable ally. Our country is fractured. We see it in our streets every day. Our economy is in the toilet. We have the second lowest GDP per person in the entire OECD, the 37 countries that make up the OECD, and we have lost faith in our democratic institutions. I want to talk about national interests because in 1967, Canadians had a clear view of their national interests and talked about them. And we hear other countries talk about their national interests right now on the world stage continuously. And as a young officer at RMC, the Royal Military College of Canada, in my 3rd year, we all took a compulsory course where we were taught the national interests of Canada. The reason we were taught them is as an officer with the maple leaf on your shoulder, you had to be able to explain to people in other countries where you would be sent to serve what Canada stood for, what we were, and why each of the national interests was so important to us, and why we were there at their request. National interests are defined by the ethics and values of citizens, all right? They are the long-term vision. And what we are missing in our country, in my opinion, is a 25-year vision, a look out to the future that we make our decisions based on a set of national interests that are clearly defined, but with that long-term goal. Those national interests then stand as the benchmark for each decision, each political decision, and each individual citizen's decision as they look towards the future. Without those national interests, things go wrong. And minor issues jump up and become major issues when they don't fit into a 25-year vision for our country. And those interests define how we interact with all the other nations of the world. And so if you don't define them, you're adrift. These are the 6 national interests that I recall being taught and that we need to redefine as a country. And we need to drill down on each of them and share them with Canadians if you're the political leadership. But Canadians need to be participative and demand to be involved in defining each of those 6 national interests. Now, I put it to you that a nation is defined first and foremost by the first 2. Unity and national security. The simplest definition of a nation is when a group of people who share common ethics and values live in a geographic area with defined borders which they are prepared to defend. So the first 2 are paramount, and we're going to drill down on national security in a minute, but just a quick word to the others. Good governance, a transparent democracy with transparent leadership who doesn't hide things, with a right-sized civil service that is as small as possible and as effective as possible, a judiciary that holds elected officials to account if they go outside of the constitution of our country, and a media that holds everyone to account. Rights and freedoms, most essential in a democracy, defined in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms that we need to take a very strong look at and decide if we're going to go forward with them. Economic and prosperity and growth, you can't fund everything in the other national interests without a strong and vibrant economy, and we know that ours is currently very challenged. Personal and community well-being is where you find the rights of an individual and the responsibilities of an individual, but as well where your healthcare system fits and other national institutions. So tonight's topic being the Canadian Forces, let's drill down on national security, one of the 6 national interests that frame our country. National security must be framed on geopolitics. Canada shares a continent with a superpower. We have to understand that. Now, if we go back to our history, prior to World War I, our protector and savior was the United Kingdom. After World War II, it's become the United States, and we need to recognize that that's the geopolitical climate that we live in, and both our trade relationships and our other partnership relationships have to be based on a realistic view of geopolitics. Your early warning systems are your intelligence services, and they must be held with respect and properly coordinated and funded. Your border services must be robust, land, sea, and air. We're blessed with 3 coasts. That helps us, but only if we actually do the job to make sure that they are coherent and protected properly. Immigration services. We need to ensure that our immigration services only bring people to Canada to be citizens who share our ethics and values. Otherwise, you're attacking the first of the 2 most paramount national interests, unity. And we can talk about that more if you wish later. Critical infrastructure protection, you have to know what it is, because not everything is critical, and you need a system to protect it. Policing is an integral part of national security at the federal, provincial, and territorial level, must be robust, coordinated, and must do its job. Our judiciary then must support all of those services above and back them up at each and every occasion, but must also ensure that the Constitution of our country is upheld. We have emergency management agencies that are both for safety and security, for human-induced and natural hazards, and link the provincial and municipal response, ever so important, to all of those other services that you see on the left-hand side. Then our roles in global stability have to actually match our national interests. If they don't match our national interests, we shouldn't be funding or expending resources towards them. And finally, in national security is the Canadian Armed Forces that we're going to drill into now. The Canadian Armed Forces is the force of last resort. People forget that key phrase. It, number 1, must be capable of being the force of last resort. It must not fail. It cannot fail. If any of the pieces that you see in national security that have come before fail, it must be there so they can be restored and backed up. It must be the force of last resort, which also means it must not be used for any of the things that come before, other than to back them up in a real emergency. I put it to you that we see the Canadian Armed Forces being used routinely for emergency management when it should never be reused for that at all. The provinces and territories are responsible for emergency management, and any task which tells the soldier to put their rifle down, not to fly their jet, or not to sail their ship, is not a role for the Canadian Forces. They are the force of last resort, and the only time they can be brought in for emergency management is when a province or territory cannot handle it themselves. And in most cases, they can, should, choose not to, because the forces are free. So now let's drill down into the Canadian Armed Forces. So we've set the Canadian Armed Forces where they belong in national security, and national security where it fits in all 6 national interests. A military is defined in simplest terms by 5 elements. Purpose, a clearly defined purpose. The purpose of the Canadian Armed Forces must be to fight and must be to be the force of last resort to ensure that our country can face all comers and that our sovereignty and all of our national interests can be defended. We're going to talk about that in more detail in a minute. The second element is combat-capable personnel. There should be no member of the Canadian Armed Forces that is not combat-capable, combat-trained, and ready to defend our country with all of the tools at their disposal. Anyone who is not combat-capable should be immediately removed from the Canadian Forces. That doesn't mean we chuck them to the curb. If we broke them, we fix them. But they cannot be retained as an active service member. They must be removed from active service and replaced with someone who can be combat capable. Military equipment. Military equipment comes in many, many forms. Ships, planes, tanks are the ones that people always think about, but we need to talk now about drones, satellites, cyber equipment. We need to think about all of the military equipment that those combat-capable personnel must have to defend our country. If we don't, those combat-capable personnel are nothing but cannon fodder. So we need the equipment and all the supplies that go with them. So if you buy a jet fighter and don't buy the weapon systems that fix on the wings, you don't have a combat piece of military equipment. They must come complete and must be maintained complete. Then the fourth element is the ability to power project those combat-capable personnel with their equipment wherever they are needed, whether it's in Canada or outside of Canada. So that's the deployment and capability system to launch them into a theater and to support them in that theater. We must have the aircraft, the ships, and all of the systems, the traffic control systems, to get them there in a safe and secure manner, and then support them through the entirety of their mission and not rely on other people and other systems that aren't reliable. And the fifth element is replacement systems. So personnel, equipment, and supplies on a routine basis. Every day, the Armed Forces consumes supplies and has equipment that breaks. So it needs to be maintained and constantly resupplied. But it also has to have a surge capability. When challenged, when the Canadian Forces has to be deployed, as in Bullet 4, we must have a surge capability for personnel and all the equipment that is predefined, pre-existing, and immediately able to kick into gear. And that implies both our industry as well as our private sector across the board that can back up, and a robust recruiting system to bring more people in, train them in a very fast manner to be combat-capable personnel. All right, let's drill down on the first two, because I want to make sure everyone is with me exactly what I mean. The only purpose for an armed forces is to fight. It's either to deter or deny the threat of use or the actual use. They are there to defend all 6 of our national interests. That's why I defined them first. In order, they have to defend the sovereignty of Canada. Then they have to defend North America with our largest trading partner and the superpower who is our best friend on this continent. Then they need to be able to defend allies and partners with prearranged agreements, but not new made up ones on the spur of the moment, and act as the force of last resort in an apolitical fashion. And they must be presented to the Canadian people as a cornerstone of our democracy. They aren't an encumbrance. They aren't a costly burden. They are the very cornerstone and the canary in the coal mine. If your armed forces isn't capable, you have ceased to be a country, and your other 6 national interests are in jeopardy. Combat capable personnel. I want to drill down on that second element. The only reason for people in the armed forces is to fight. If they're not flying a jet, not sailing a ship, or using military equipment, they should not be used for anything else. They're either training to use it or they're using it. They have an unlimited nature in their service. That means they sign up knowing they can die for their country. That means Canada owes them an obligation to have the best equipment to make sure they don't give their lives in vain. They come in Army, Navy, Air Force, and Special Forces, and each of those is different and must be treated differently and must be trained and equipped properly. They need to have a presence in every province and territory in Canada. Why? So the Canadian public sees them every single day in the performance of their duties and their training. They are part of every community. They are Canadian citizens, and they must be visible in every one of our provinces and territories for the people of Canada. In my opinion, the minimum number is 120,000. In 1965, there was 105,000 personnel in uniform in the Army, Navy, and Air Force. It is a disgrace that we would even talk about a number less than 120,000. That's 4 divisions deployed across Canada, and a specialized brigade group in the north, plus a full Air Force, a full Navy, and Special Forces. They must be epically, constantly trained and tested. And by epic, I mean ethically fit, physically fit, intellectually fit. And the 4th element, which is courage, is paramount. If they don't have the courage to apply their ethics, physical fitness, and intellectual supremacy every single day, they are of no use as a person in the Canadian Forces, and they need to be removed. They are not a social experiment. They're not for peacekeeping or emergency management. Happy to discuss that later. And they must have respectful treatment from the Canadian public and from parliamentarians from every political party. We must also have massive respectful treatment for our veterans when they cease to be members of the Canadian Forces, so all of Canadian society recognizes the unlimited nature of their service and that we owe them a debt until they are no longer Canadian citizens. This shows statements from the media in the last few years that show that the government doesn't understand the Canadian Armed Forces. Without a government that understands the Canadian Forces, there's no way to rebuild the armed forces. So let's talk about a way ahead. Canada requires an immediate establishment of a task force. I've worked task force all through my career. Closing of Canadian Forces Europe, closing of all our elements in the former Republic of Yugoslavia, and then reinserting a brigade group back in, doing counterterrorism for the province of Alberta and ultimately on both sides of the border was always built through a task force structure that had a single focus and achieved an aim. These people that are assigned to the task force must have no other commitment for 3 years. They must be experienced in all of those areas. They have must be assigned in the mission analysis to the tasks implied and given, an immediate set of 6-month goals that I'll talk about in a minute. At the end of that 3-year period, the aim is to be a world-recognized, credible Canadian Armed Forces again. And then they must fit into a 5-year vision for our country in a detailed, legislated fashion. So let's talk about the 6-month goals. I'm almost through. I just want to make sure you understand this isn't something that I take lightly, and this is something that has meat to the bone. They first must define the purpose of the Canadian Armed Forces. And they must establish a working group within the task force that writes a new white paper on defense within 1 year, a complete white paper shared with the public of Canada and built with the public of Canada that fully describes the purpose of the Canadian Forces. They need to have a plan to immediately retain the people that are in uniform that are combat capable. They need to draft immediately a plan within that 6-month period, how they're going to recruit, train, and retrain combat capable people. And that is not a numbers game. It is not to bring people who are physically unfit, ethically unfit, or intellectually unfit. They must be able to be made combat capable within 10 weeks. There must be a fast track process to replace our most essential equipment. They must be a plan that's fully implemented to restore to a serviceable condition everything we currently have, so there is equipment for those combat capable personnel to train on while we get new equipment. There must be a definition of an apolitical process to procure equipment and supplies outside of the normal procurement system that takes decades to buy a ship. It has to be able to turn it around within 3 years to buy new, large-scale equipment. There must be the definition of that deployment system with aircraft, ships, and dedicated resources to move our forces anywhere in Canada or anywhere in the world that's defined by the purpose that we wrote in the first bullet. There must be a complete detailed communications plan to fully engage the Canadian public as we go through this 6-month process. And any legislation that's required must be fast-tracked in a parliament to make it all lifelong standing. So let me wrap up my presentation. A nation is only successful when a group of people with common shared ethics, values, and beliefs live inside defended borders. If you don't have those two core elements, you don't have a nation. Canadians have to demand a vision for Canada, and it must be built on all 6 national interests. And I put it to you, there's a requirement for a task force focused on unity, national security, good governance, each of the 6, all the way down. They must break them apart into pieces and present them to the Canadian public and make sure the Canadian public understands and agrees or don't move forward. We must rebuild all areas of national security, not just the Canadian Forces, because without good intelligence, without an immigration system, without a strong border security system, without each of those pieces that I had on that slide, the Canadian Armed Forces is just the canary that says the whole thing's broke. But the thing is broke, and we need to rebuild each of those areas that was on the national security slide. Canada must start a task force immediately to rebuild the Canadian Armed Forces and our national defense. And it must meet, as a minimum, those 6-month tasks with a full 3-year mandate that they must stand and meet under a government that does not hold the armed forces in disdain, that is dedicated to supporting the members who are prepared to give their lives for this country. Canadians need to understand and be reacquainted with the Highway of Heroes. They need to understand that the cornerstone of a nation is its ability to defend itself. If you want more, I give you these 2 references. They are papers that I have had published in the last year. One is about the national interests and how to rebuild them, a complete step-by-step process to rebuild all six. And the second is how to rebuild the Canadian forces based on the national interests and based on a study of national security. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I stand ready to answer your questions.
Well, David, thank you very much. That was fast and furious. There's a ton of stuff in there. I have a bunch of questions, but I'm going to open up to the floor first. And the first question up here is Ken Ruler. So, Ken, I will turn the floor over to you. Please go ahead with your question.
I was wondering, Dave, do you think that there should be compulsory military service for Canadians, and or should there be a fast-track program for new Canadians to get their Canadian citizenship earlier by joining the Canadian Forces?
All right, so I'll answer that in two parts. First of all, conscription has never worked in Canada. I don't believe it's a good method for the Canadian Forces, because what you normally end up with is very disgruntled people who aren't combat capable. I want people to join the Canadian Forces who understand that the only purpose for them to join is to be combat capable. So let me take the second, not the second piece, but let me take why not conscription one step further. I believe Canadians should be required to give 1 year of national service. I don't believe that has to be to the Canadian Armed Forces. For those that choose the Armed Forces, that would be perhaps a way to fast track recruiting and a way to build a larger base. But remember what I said about emergency management. With the premiers of this country, I tried to get them to understand that the response to all emergencies was their task. And I even presented a framework for an emergency management battalion. One of the things you'll notice in that battalion, and it's about 800 personnel, not one of them carried a gun. There's no need for a gun when you're filling sandbags or chopping down trees for fire guards. In national service, a 1 year period with 6 months of training followed by 6 months of use, they would be available either into an emergency management situation at the call of municipalities where they live, or at the federal order of government in some kind of a force of that nature, but not military, not the force of last resort. People who want to be, okay, second part of your question was, should there be a fast track way for new citizens coming to our country? One of the groups that we've noticed over decades that is the last to join into the Canadian Forces is new citizens. And it's largely because many of them came from countries where the military wasn't necessarily something they trusted. So trust needs to be built first. And so I put it to you that I don't believe a fast track way to become a citizen of a country is through the armed forces. Again, I want that force to be the force of last resort. And I want people that are there want to be there for a career, not for a ticket punch to in 5 years become a citizen and leave. I know it takes 10 years in a peacetime army to build a capable sergeant. Doug Stinson's on the call. When Doug and I were brand new lieutenants in Calgary back in 1976, 77, our platoons, my first platoon was 85 soldiers. I had 5 warrant officers, 1 sergeant, 1 master corporal. All the rest were privates because we had just gone through the Pierre Trudeau years of trying to destroy our armed forces. And we were tasked with trying to train 70 privates with no one to train them. So I'm trying to get to a situation where we retain people. I want people to work up to sergeant and say, no life like it used to be a joke, but I want them to say it again. I want them to stay. I don't want them to leave. And they're leaving in droves right now because they see no purpose and they see no combat capability. I want people who choose the armed forces because they want to be combat capable soldiers and want to defend our country. So not to be negative, but no, I don't believe we should fast track new citizens that way. I want people who want to join, but I do believe that we need a civil defense force that is at the beck and call of municipal order of government and provincial order of government, and even first responders. And one of the ways might be 1 year of national citizenship for the youth of our country who are currently experiencing a terrible unemployment ratio.
Sure. Thank you.
Sure.
Ken, does that answer the question?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
Okay, Cam Ross, can I pass the torch to you now?
Great presentation, Dave. Well done.
Thank you, sir.
Question is about your 120,000. Why not 100? Why not 150,000? How did you arrive at that? And what percentage of that number would be reserve force and regular force, especially your comments about domestic operations in general?
Okay.
And your funding model, because that's a lot of people in challenging economic times that we have right now. I'm not disagreeing with you at all, but in a 3-year program, that's a lot of cash, and we have an election coming up. How do we convince Canadians that they got to put the money where it counts? And lastly, you didn't mention anything about cyber. Reason for that? Defense.
I snuck it in as a little piece, but I will talk about that. So you've asked me, I think, 4 questions, and so when I miss some, Cam, come back at me, okay? And ask me to define. So how did I get to 120? Let me frame for you. This is one man's mind. That's why I want a task force. I want, like what we did during counterterrorism, I want the 26 smartest people in Alberta to sit down and build a task force on security. I want to take probably about that number, 30 smartest people in our country, and I listed what the qualifications are, sit them in the room and burn their brain up for a week to define a force structure. All right? And do all of those other essential pieces. Task given, those would be my tasks given. I listed them on the slide. Tasks implied. So you have to take each of the tasks given and pull it apart, just like we did on the Task Force on Security for Counterterrorism back in 2001. How did I come up with 120,000? Let me give you a rough framework. I believe the Atlantic provinces should, let's talk Army first, then I'll go to the other 2 services and Special Forces. And in Special Forces, I include cyber. So let's start with the Army. I believe there should be a division, not less than 11,000 per division. I believe there should be a division in the Atlantic provinces, and they must be deployed such that there is a physical presence in every major area of the Atlantic provinces, so Canadians see, identify with, and become friends with their armed forces again. That's the Atlantic. That's 11,000. Quebec, 11,000. Ontario, 11,000. I'm going with land masses. So I lied to you. I said 4, I meant 5. I believe Manitoba and Saskatchewan should be a division. In Alberta and British Columbia. And the reason I grouped those 2, one of the biggest hazards that we've got, and one of the reasons that we actually have a military plan, is for the catastrophic earthquake on the British Columbia coast. So first of all, we have a coastline to defend, but we have to understand that there's a mountain range that we need to deal with. And so I want the same commander responsible for both sides of that mountain range. So that's 5 divisions spread across our country. And I would put the Armored Division in Manitoba, Saskatchewan for training value and for the ability to do proper training, and the others to be mixed component. Then for the North, for all 3 territories, I would use a brigade group structure and specialize them purely in Arctic warfare. Now, if you add all that up, you're going to come to about 60,000. 30,000 Air Force, 30,000 Navy, with pieces of special forces attached around them, I get to 120,000 real quick. Okay? 30,000 Air Force, 30,000 Navy, that's 60 on top. Add that all together, and then you build into your special forces that immediate long-range strike capability that we see in JTF2, but with the appropriate elements and transport and all the rest of it, and a complete cyber section within that is there. Okay, let's go back to the concept. For all of you that have served at echelons above corps and above, you need core troops. So in every one of those divisions, there's division troops. And then above that, there needs to be core troops. And into that core troops is where you put your cyber element and you put your special forces and you build that kind of a structure. So why do I do that? Because our allies recognize that type of structure, but as well, you give a footprint for all Canadians to see. So let's go to your next. I think I covered a bunch of points there, but let's now go to money. The money we currently spend for defense elements that are not commitments to our alliances and that are not directly related to our national interests, I put it to you, are at least $40 billion on an annual basis. It's time for government to make the difficult decision and stop those funding until we are a trustworthy ally again. And you retract those fundings and you put them into the accelerated process, because when I was closing Canadian Forces Europe LAR, I recognized right away I had 1,100 people under my command to close 18,000 Canadians and bring them home. You peak your money first. It costs more to close a base than to run a base. So you have to peak, and then you can start to ramp down to your steady state 25-year model after the first 3 years. But you're going to have to push a real push. Now, how do you build a recruiting system? Well, you can. We went through it before. We've done this twice before. We did it after the Pierre Trudeau years. We did it after the Jean Chrétien years, when all of a sudden we had September the 11th. We can do this. We've got people who are still walking around, and someone like Perrin Beatty, who I'm sure some of you know, actually wrote a kind of smart white paper that was never actually published back before the Harper government fell. We need to go back and pull back out good ideas that were never wrong. But so that's my force structure and why I say 120, and I say that's the minimum. Then the funding and cyber. So what did I miss, Cam? Sorry.
With the time available and letting other questioners come on, the percentage of regular force and reserve force in that structure. I understand the 5 divisions, brigade up north, but they're not all, can't be all regular force. There's got to be a huge component. As a former 5 div commander, I am very supportive of the reserves, and we are way under strength in reserves.
Okay, so as long as we understand, and many Canadians don't, many Canadians believe the reserves are like the National Guard. Okay, and they're not. They have nothing. They don't belong to provincial authorities and should never belong to provincial authorities. As long as we're looking at reserves as augmentation to the regular force, for this first 3 years, that can be their only role, and every penny spent has to be for combat-capable personnel, not for social clubs. Okay? And I'm being candid here. We need to make sure that we put our money where our mouth is, and we actually make sure that every dime spent is to create combat-capable personnel that fit into one of the 5 pieces of an armed forces, okay? One of the 5 elements. So I'm supportive of the reserves, probably after the 3-year period, up in the first part of the 3-year period, status quo, and don't let them fall apart.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Okay, sir, thanks for that. Joe, you want to ask your question about industrial offshoots here?
I shall. David, first of all, thank you very much for even agreeing to come on further to our conversations over the last month, and thank you for the presentation. My question in 3 words or less is, what's more important, interoperability or protection of sovereignty? In the past month, there's been a piece in the Ottawa Citizen with Mark Norman saying the U.S. controls some of the C2 systems on our ships. That should not be. And in today's National Post, the U.S. was threatening that no matter where Canada goes for its aircraft, it's going to be touching upon the use of intellectual property which is owned by the United States, whether the government or its defense industrial base. This is an unfair question, but these are always the good ones. If we were advising the government, the military establishment, and Canada's defense industrial base, how do we break this cycle of wanting to be interoperable with our allies, yet at the same time being able to absolutely control the C2 systems or C4I systems that control our hardware? Thank you.
Okay, so number 1, we'll never be able to control all our C2 systems or our military kit. If you remember when the British went to the Falkland Islands. The reason the British ship wasn't sunk was because the French wouldn't arm the Exocet missiles on the on the Argentinian aircraft. Okay, no country in the world is ever going to have 100% control of their operating systems. And I put it to you that even if we built every single piece of kit in Canada, the Chinese would be smart enough to have a part that was put into one of those systems that would have a kill switch on it. Do I think that Canadian engineers are smart enough to find the kill switches and get rid of them? I hope so. And that's where I have to put my hope for the first 3 years while we rebuild an industrial complex in Canada. Really good paying jobs in Canada. If they know that we have 100,000 force and that we are going to be sustaining it for 25 years, it is now economically viable to build a defense industry in Canada. Do I think we'll ever have 100%? We'll be lucky if we get 50%. So the whole discussion about where do we buy the kit from, to me, is a false flag, a red herring to try and do nothing. F-35s, we already have parts chains that are built into the supply system for the F-35 going worldwide in Canada. See, if we bite our nose off to spite our face and cancel the F-35 order, we're probably throwing away $4 to $7 billion and all the economic benefits. Yes, there's probably a kill switch in the F-35. Do you think there isn't going to be one in the Swedish aircraft? There's always going to be a way, and we have to be smart enough to figure out how to overcome it. But if we don't believe that the United States has a vested interest in protection of North America, then I think we're crazy. And so, to a degree, remember, every election in the US, the government there changes too. And we need to stop talking about Trump and start talking about Canada and rebuilding our country. Every one of the 6 national interests, and one of them, a dedicated task force on economic prosperity and growth that includes an industrial manufacturing capability for our country. But in the short term, folks, we're buying off the shelf, or we're not going to have an armed forces.
Thank you.
Great response, David. And the Cam Ross just pointed out that even the Gripen has U.S. components on board.
I put it to you that another NATO country was looking at the Gripen, and the United States said, you can't have the Pratt & Whitney engines that go in it. You would keep on the F-35, or you won't be buying the Gripen either. Now, I don't know if that's true, but the United States right now is using their economy to challenge the world. Stop talking about the United States. Let's talk about Canada and what we can achieve here, in my opinion.
Joe, does that answer the question?
Yeah, it does. And I had heard that story today about the U.S. engines in the Gripen, and that, in fact, it was I think the Raphael who has the lowest level of U.S. IP in it, but it still has got enough to thwart an all-Canadian effort. But anyway, to answer your question, Quentin, yes, my questions are answered. Thank you very much. Don't want to take up any more time. Thank you.
Fred Moret, let's pass the torch to you because we're going to continue this discussion about industrial bases.
David, thank you very much. Just for background, I'm an old Black Hatter, Hussar, Strathcona. Been out for a couple decades, so don't want to betray my age at this point.
I'm 71. Feel better?
Just a little bit. Thank you. So I think my question is going to take a little bit of different tangent than what I wrote, considering the conversation we just had on the industrial base. I'm not sure that I would agree at this point that we can ignore Trump and that we can continue to look to the States as that unwavering ally, et cetera. Diversifying our defense relationships and reinforcing perhaps our relationships with Europe is probably what we need to do. the mobilization of our industrial base is part of our national mobilization plan that we need to have. If I look at what Sweden is doing, what Finland is doing, it's all encompassing across society. It incorporates a civil defense corps that you've mentioned before and that others have written about as well. So how do we mobilize our society and mobilize our industrial base quickly enough such that this 3-year target for credible cash, which is, is pretty aggressive without the tools to do it with, right? How do we mobilize that when there is a lack of recognition or acceptance overall in Canada and by the main political parties that we're actually looking at a threat? Right. Every senior leader that I've listened to for the last 2 years has been saying that we have somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 years before Russia decides to do some move on, on the Baltics, et cetera. Trump's comments about annexation, the 51st state, et cetera, military or no military component to that, who knows for sure. But what it does is by him allowing the Russians free reign across Europe, it gives him the legitimacy from his mind to do what he wants to do in the Americas, which is the old Jacksonian approach, Monroe Doctrine, Manifest Destiny, et cetera. So neither of our political parties is talking about what really needs to be done to quickly ramp up the forces. So how do we get that done so that we can effect that national mobilization?
Okay, good. Lots of pieces there. Let me go back to step one in the estimate of the situation. Enemy, after task given, enemy forces. I strongly contend that Russia is not the primary threat. I strongly contend that China is the primary threat and that the Canadian public needs to be made aware of it, and that this current sitting government has been compromised enough that they'll never hear it. But I don't believe if there's a change in government that will continue. China owns 140, I used to say 140, it's now 147 on the bricks and mortar Silk Road. They now control 140 votes in the UN. The UN is completely compromised and is no longer a viable function. 147 votes. China can steer the boat any way they want. China is funding Iran completely and totally, with people marching in the streets of Canada on a daily basis. Russia is not. It is time for Canada to wake up and reorient to the national list of threats. China, Iran, Russia. Okay, I put them in that order. I don't get rid of Russia. I don't plan to walk away from NATO, but I believe that NATO is not our number one vision right now. The West Coast is, not the East Coast. And for old guys like me that spent 3 tours during the 70s and 80s and 90s in Europe, that's hard for me to say because I know that theater so well. I ran tanks and people supported tanks and people all over that friggin' theater war for a long time. It's time to reorient. I believe if we have a change in government, that's possible. If there's no change in government, folks, everything I've just said cannot occur until there is a government that understands the 6 national interests of our country and the importance of national security. Notice I didn't say national defense. I said national security. The minute someone takes national security seriously, they have to start with intelligence services, and the intelligence services have been begging the current government to understand the threat that China is making in our streets. If they can, one of the bullets on that first 6-month slide was the communications plan to the Canadian public. I put it to you that on a dime, the Highway of Heroes appeared out of nowhere, not funded by any government, but by Canadian citizens who recognized what was happening to their citizens that were prepared to pay the ultimate sacrifice. I believe the Canadian public needs to be made aware of what's happening in our country right now. And that then gives the impetus to understand that national defense is the canary in the coal mine is dead in a death spiral said by the Minister of National Defense, and Mark Carney left him as Minister of National Defense. I want to make sure that you understand that my paper isn't aimed at the current sitting government, because they hold the armed forces in disdain and have repeatedly proven the point. So Canadians need to become aware. And one of the things that happened back, I unfortunately was one of the guys who had to implement CR90, which was removing the armed forces from 85,000 down to 60,000 in the 1990s under the Chrétien government. And it's part of the reason I quit in 1999, because the Canadian public was being lied to. It was actually going to 40,000, less than the New York City Police Department, Army, Navy, and Air Force. So what we need to be able to do is re-engage the public with the realities of what's happening in our country, and then get them to stand behind national security and ultimately then behind national defense within 6 months. Not easy. You need professionals, and that's why I put media in the group of people that need to be in that task force. Credible media.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, David, thanks very much for that. And Frederick, does that address your concerns?
Probably not, because it's not an easy question.
It's a really tough question. And
I'll just say, I'll just say this: that in the line of work that I'm doing right now, we're regularly seeing the influence of Russia, GRU, et cetera, as part of what's going on in Europe, and with the cyber stuff, hybrid stuff going on here as well. If we look at a multipolar world, China, Russia, USA as the big players, letting go of Russia free hand in Europe is just going to encourage China more. So I agree that China is a major threat, and I've seen the evidence of foreign influence in the country in the work that I'm doing as well. So I agree with that. I'm just not prepared to say that we can just close our eyes to Russia, which is a little bit of what I'm sensing, that one is a huge priority and the other one isn't.
Let me expand a little bit on Russia. I believe that Russia has learned a lot of lessons in the last 3 years. I don't doubt that. And I don't believe that the KGB, FSB, whatever you want to call them today, has given up their mission. And I also am one of the people who has said for the past 5 years, when everybody called me stupid, that Mr. Putin made his intentions on returning to the Soviet Union very clear 12 years ago. There's no doubt in my mind he'd like to do it. I just don't believe he has the force generation and the capability to do it now that Europe has finally woken up. I would have agreed with you totally 2 years ago, but not now that we see Germany finally rearming. And you and I probably both served beside the German forces, or at least I did, and many of the people in the group. The 2 German Corps was on my right, and I worked extensively with them on 2 postings in Germany. I know what the Germans are capable, and now that they're awake again, thank goodness, as well as France and others, and Britain with their nuclear capability. I believe it's their job now to handle Mr. Putin at least for 3 years while we get our act together to be able to help them if we ever can in the future. So Russia, I believe, is more manageable. I believe China will go, and they're not just going for Taiwan within 3 years. And I mean militarily, I don't mean economically.
Yeah, I was ACH Recce in Germany, 87 to 91, the last full tour. So I've seen that piece as well. Okay, thank you. This clarifies in my mind as well.
Okay, great stuff. I'm going to go now. We're going to switch gears a bit. I'm going to pass the floor to Lawrence Johnson to talk about people and social experimentation. And then Stuart, I see you have your hand up. So after Lawrence, we'll go to Stuart.
Hi, good evening, sir. Thoroughly enjoying your presentation. Your thoughts, please, on the issue of social experimentation within a future rebuilt armed forces. I feel a little bit better about going into the political scene as how gentlemen proceeding up there. So I'm a Calgary Highlander, by the way.
Understood. Sir, 2 tours in Calgary. Know your unit.
Yeah, thank you.
Back in the 70s, and I was the CO, and that unfortunately had to move my battalion from Calgary to Edmonton back in 96.
Boy, I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah, we did the big freedom of the city.
Yeah.
So DEI and all the social experiments, you saw them on my slide under combat capable personnel. They have absolutely no place in the force of last resort. If you're going to do social experiments and DEI, anything that is not based on merit, anything that is not based on merit has no place when people's lives as the ultimate force of last resort are on the line. We must remove all of that. The only way you get to be a corporal is if you prove you are combat capable in every way. It has nothing to do with any other metric. And so I believe they have absolutely no place in the Canadian Armed Forces whatsoever. And I put it to you, let me tell you a very brief story. When I was a CO closing LAR in Europe, the commanding officer for the closure of the technical services branch, I had an officer who went on a German-Canadian seminar. When the Germany's reunited, everyone major and above in the East German army was remote. Captain and below could stay, only if they chose to do so. On a captain's course, 10 Germans, 10 Canadians, there was one East German captain, and after the first day, he quit the German army because he realized everything he'd been taught by his parents, by his teachers, and by his government had been a lie. We were never going to attack Russia. They were going to attack us, and everything he knew. So coming back to your question about DEI and everything else in our armed forces, I believe, unfortunately, for sure, everyone above the rank of lieutenant colonel is suspect, and everyone above the rank of master warrant officer and above is suspect. They have bought into this stuff hook, line, and sinker. Now, we don't just throw them all out, but we have to ensure that we retain people in the task force who understand the word merit.
There. Good. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Lawrence. I'll pass it over to Stuart now.
Very much. Long time no see. So hello, everybody from Palm Springs. I'm now happily retired and practicing my golf. So great presentation. Haven't seen each other for at least 25, 30 years. You brought up some good points that I think we all know. We've all envisioned it. All those priorities we have to go through. The thing is trying to get traction, whether it be Pierre Trudeau or Justin Trudeau or Kutchen. Mulroney had the same issue with downsizing back and forth, and they shut down Europe. My question here is, now that you've got Trump in power, you need to talk about Trump because he's doing all the saber rattling and getting us to actually spend money, maybe not to the speed that we need to. But we've always only fallen short of our NATO spend. We've always been reliant upon the U.S. We've always become complacent that they won't look after us because we don't look after ourselves for political will. So here's my question, is how do we plant the seed and make it grow fast? Because we all believe in it. That's great. But then you don't have the political will in Ottawa to make it happen. So how do we maneuver that to get somebody to speak on behalf of the Canadian forces? The CBS can't do it. They can inform, they can advise, but they're there to support whatever government is in play. So how do we do that? Minister of National Defense, you've got Bill Blair, doesn't really have any kind of military background whatsoever. Previous Minister of National Defense haven't had that either. So who's the voice of the Canadian Armed Forces to the political will?
Okay. So let's start with the fact that Trump has given us a golden opportunity. You now stoke Canadian nationalism, and I think you will find a far more willing public today than even in December. That's why one of the pieces I put in the first 6 months is the communications piece and strong, capable people in that task force who understand how to make another Highway of Heroes sing and resonate. I don't know if you watched the commander of the Army yesterday give a presentation in the Stimson Center in the United States. He openly admitted that there is 2,000 soldiers in Latvia with a surge to 3,000, and that's it. His force generation capability is expended, and that doesn't leave him equipment or money to train what's in Canada. That's what he said in the United States to a think tank. The only focus, he stated, not me, he stated in that session yesterday, you can look it up, Stimson Group. He stated the only focus for the armed forces is to try and get the number of people joining up. Not combat capable people, anyone, because that's the metric that the CDS has been told is most important. Not equipment, not training, just numbers. Groups like yours needs to put pressure on whoever becomes the government if they show even a slightest glimmering interest. And I mean all the groups like this. I don't know if you saw Perrin Beatty 6 months ago, hopeful that maybe there would be a change in government, saying he was going to dedicate the rest of his life to rebuilding the Canadian forces. Okay? Because he knew that national security in this country was important. And so there's people like that waiting for an opportunity to talk. And right now, there's no one allowed to talk.
That's a very good point. Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart. We have one more question on the board from Roland. But before we do that, I'd just like to point out it's the top of the hour. David, are you comfortable continuing?
I'll stay as long as there's questions.
Okay. And as for the audience, those of you who have other commitments and you need to drop off, thank you very much for attending. Those of you who'd like to continue and listen in, we'll carry on. With that said,
thank you for having me.
Thank you. With that said, I'll pass the torch to Roland.
First off, I wanted to say thank you so much for this presentation. Excellent. I agree wholeheartedly. An old 746 comm squadron guy here from Mwata Armories way back in the early 70s. So anyways, my question is, and in terms of long-term goals, and you mentioned one of your other presentations somewhere along the line, that Canada really should have a 25-year plan for its military and all these other areas and pillars. So my thought was, is it unrealistic to have 1% of Canada's population in the military? So based on Stats Canada's website this later today, at 41.5 million, that would be 415,000 soldiers. You could divvy that up with, say, 200,000 active and 220,000 reserves, or that could be called up quickly. Any which way you want to slice that. Thoughts? Go ahead.
I totally agree. If Canada could field a force of 105,000 in 1965 with 20 million, remember the song? Now we are 20 million. At 40 million, we should be able to deploy at least double that, right? 220 million. And we are a country. One of the things that I say in both papers, but particularly in the one on national interest, Canada has the 38th largest population in the world, according to world stats, and the second largest landmass. There is probably no way Canada can defend all three coasts, our land coast, and that entire geographic mass, even if we wanted to, with 40 million people. So we are going to have to count on partners, allies, and our big neighbor to the south. Hopefully, in a number of years, that will have not necessarily manifest destiny on its mind in a way that's more meaningful. But today, I was listening to that conversation yesterday from Stimson Center, And very proudly, the commander of the Army said, we were able to deploy 120 reservists on an annual basis once a year to do a sovereignty exercise in the North. Well, that doesn't deter anyone. Okay. So, yes, I agree with you. We should be able to field something more larger. Now, I grew up in a country, both my mother and father served in uniform. They were both in the RCF in World War II. My mother served in Newfoundland, which was an overseas posting at the time. My father flew in the Pacific in Catalina flying boats, both in the RCAF. And so I grew up in a household that had an understanding of the military and a support of it. My grandfather fought in the trenches all 4 years of World War I. So, but I don't expect other Canadians are like me. And so if I could achieve 120 combat ready, deployable anywhere within our country and globally, then Canada might be taken far more seriously as a trusted ally and partner again. If we could make that to 200,000 in a 25-year vision, wonderful. But I would also want the question I had before about 1 year national service, or at least an emergency management force, probably of 10,000 in every one of the major provinces or regions of Canada, that's available on a dime for fires, floods, tornadoes, terrorism inside our country without weapons. All right. So if you can combine emergency management with the armed forces, you can do far more. When I talk about critical infrastructure protection, what we built in Alberta was a scaled system where private sector was responsible up to level 3, but level 4 and level 5 needed either police of jurisdiction in much increased numbers than they are now, or the military. And the only way to establish a no-fly zone is with jets. All right. And ground-based defense systems normally coming from the military. So we need to integrate into our critical infrastructure protection process across our whole country, the military. And that's why I want a footprint across the whole country. So yes, I desperately would like to see in a 25-year vision, all 6 of the national interests pushed. And if you actually, within 10 years, rebuild the economy of Canada to be a superpower in critical minerals, in oil and gas, in industrial capability, in all those other areas with some form of defense industry, you can afford to fund 200,000 in uniform. Okay? You need economic and prosperity and growth to re-engage. And if Canadians see that joining the military, even if it's for a 4, 10, or 20-year commitment, is a thing of national pride and something to do with their lives, you will see far more wanting to join it and stay in it. Sure.
Roland, I'm seeing a thumbs up there. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Yes, it does. Okay. It does. It does. Thank you very much. In fact, much more detail than I expected. Thank you.
Sure.
You should be you should be one of those people that speaks directly to government.
I've tried.
Right. I'm scanning through the chat right now, and it looks like the questions are starting to dry up. David, you made the comment about political will, and that's been a sort of a thread through here, and it's a subtext in your presentation. So what is it that you think will be required to light a fire under our politicians to make them appreciate the requirement for a military?
We need a government that believes in national security, and I mean all of it. I mean, starting with the intelligence services that have been ignored and far worse, diminished and treated with the same as the other elements. We need the police to be re-engaged and actually arrest people on our streets who are making terrorist threats on a daily basis, and the public needs to see that. So we need a government that actually believes in all of national security, all those elements I listed on that slide. Without that, you have a government who is complicit. And so we need people in government at each of the orders of government, federal, provincial, and municipal, that talk to individual responsibility. Okay. And that is available That is one of the choices in the next election. If we choose not to do that, then we will continue down the path where government must manage every small, slight. When you're insulted, the person who insults you should go to jail, right? And we're in that kind of a society, and we need to walk it back. It's not fast, it's hard. And that's why I want communications experts in that task force if we form a task force.
Okay. So this is more of a societal problem than simply a military problem.
It definitely
And
is.
again, your framing of national security speaks to that.
And all 6 national interests. So the first paper defines the challenge and then defines the solution, just like my one unfit for duty defines the challenge and defines the solution. If you disagree with the solution, great. That's why I wrote the papers, is to have a discussion and to engage people in how do we walk this back? How do we, over the next decade, walk Canada back so that my grandchildren can now walk out the door into a Canada that I recognized in 1967, that they can recognize maybe within a decade?
Okay.
I thank you all. I thank you for listening.
David, thank you very much for that. Very enlightening and informative presentation. There's lots to chew on here. And I think you've succeeded in pulling the lens out a bit and opening the lens from focusing purely on national defense to focusing on national security. And I think that's an important framing piece. So again, I thank you for that. Joe, any comments from you?
No, nothing that you haven't already mentioned, Quentin. This is first class, and I have to thank everybody here because it was a team effort, and thank Cam Ross for those very nice comments. So this is a brilliant presentation, and David, you get all the credit. Thank you very much, as well as Angela for orchestrating this thing in the first place. Well done, everybody. Thank you.
David, I'll leave the last word to you.
I just want to thank you all for attending, and I hope you engage with any of your local politicians, whether they're municipal, provincial, or federal. Demand that they at least talk about this stuff. Forward my papers or not, forward this presentation or not, but engage your politicians, because like it or not, that's our government. And we need a responsive government, one that represents the will of the people.
On that note, David, thank you very much. For everybody out there, thank you for attending.